Pawns are the 8 little pieces you get at the start of a chess game. I know they don't look very important, but knowing how to use them will give you the power to beat other players so effortlessly that you'll start feeling guilty after the first 10 games. In this video, I'm going to teach you everything there is to know about pawns, and by the end of it, you will discover that you are a god of chess. Or a very slow learner. Let's get started. How do they move? They move in straight lines, 1 square at a time. The first time you move them, they can move 2 squares like this. They take diagonally, like this. They cannot take the same way they move, which means this is not allowed. If you try to do this, you will be bullied for your stupidity even more than usual. There's also an eccentric French move called en passant. If a pawn moves 2 squares, you can capture it as if it has only moved 1 square, but only with a pawn. It looks like this. If this seems complicated, don't worry. It will get much more difficult very soon. If you get one of your pawns to the other side of the board, you can turn it into any piece you want. Always pick a queen. Under-promoting is for attention-seeking tryhards. Pawns are used to control space on the board. The further up the board your pawns are, the more space they control. Having space is good, because it means your opponent will have a harder time moving their pieces to good squares. For example, in this position, black cannot develop their knight because this pawn would massacre it. In this position, black's bishop is completely useless because it is blocked in by pawns. When you have more space, your pieces can do what they want, and your opponent's pieces are useless. Comprende? Comprende. Pawns are also used to protect your king. Keep pawns close to your king at all times. If your king doesn't have pawns in front of it, you are pretty much definitely going to lose. So don't do that. Pawn structure. Pawn structure is the name for the arrangement of the totality of your pawns. In other words, their structure. Good pawn structures have the following features. Pawn chains. This is when pawns are aligned along a diagonal. This means that they protect each other. Pawns at the back of the chain are the weakest because they have no pawns protecting them. You can make triangles with pawn chains like this, which just like the Zimbabwean economy are extremely stable. Forward central pawns. When your pawns are forward and in the center, it's good. If you don't understand why, watch this video and you will understand why. If you still don't understand why, I don't understand why. Connected pawns. Pawns work much better when they are next to each other. If they are separated, they cannot form chains, and therefore are much less effective at controlling space. A series of connected pawns is called a pawn island. The fewer pawn islands you have, the better. In this position, white has 1 pawn island, and black has 3 pawn islands. Therefore, white has better pawn structure. Bad pawn structures have the following features. Isolated pawns. If a pawn has no pawns on either side of it, it is isolated. Being isolated is bad for pawns because it means they are much easier to capture. Being isolated is bad for you because it gives you depression. Double pawns. If a pawn is in front of another pawn, it means that the pawn behind it cannot move, and it cannot form a diagonal with the pawn in front of it. Avoid double pawns unless you have a specific reason. For example, here, black has to choose between taking with the queen and taking with the g-pawn. Take a moment to find the correct move, based on the extremely obvious and spoon-fed setup I have just given you. Well done. Backward pawns. If one of your pawns is behind the 2 pawns adjacent to it, and it cannot be safely advanced, it's a backward pawn. This is a backward pawn. This is also a backward pawn. This is not a backward pawn because you can safely advance it. Backward pawns are bad because they are incapable of being defended by other pawns and are therefore much weaker. Avoid creating backward pawns. When you see backward pawns in your opponent's position, attack them. If you have a backward pawn, or even multiple, don't worry. Just resign. Moving on. Pawn tension. When pawns are able to capture each other, but don't, this is pawn tension. Pay attention to tension. New players will usually be terrified of pawn tension and just trade immediately. This is not optimal, because you can use pawn tension to your advantage. For example, black could take this pawn immediately, but it would just give white free development after the bishop takes on c4. Instead, wait until they move the bishop first and then take it. White has to move to c4 anyway, and they've wasted a move. As the great philosopher Ben S. Chess once said, never waste moves. Prophylaxis. This means to make anticipatory moves, which prevent your opponent from achieving their goals. The Knight or Sicilian is characterized by the prophylactic move a6, which prevents the bishop from coming to b5. To use pawns for prophylaxis, you need to look at your opponent's position and consider what they are trying to achieve. If stopping a more powerful move is more important than making a move of your own, prevent it by covering the square with a pawn. Prophylaxis usually looks boring and pointless, but so do you, and I haven't given up on you yet. Pawn sacrifices. Pawns are useful because they are mostly useless, which means sometimes you can give them up for free to get a tactical shot or to gain a positional advantage. For example, here you can sacrifice a pawn to create holes in white's structure which will allow you to attack their king. I cannot sufficiently emphasize the following statement. Do not sacrifice pawns without a good reason. Why? Because you will need them in the endgame. Shockingly, the endgame is the part of the game near the end. It starts when the majority of pieces have been traded off. This means that play is centered around the pawns. The most important goal in the endgame is to promote your pawns. If you have fewer pawns than your opponent, even a good player will probably lose. You, on the other hand, will definitely lose. To win with pawns in the endgame, you need to understand the following ideas. Passed pawns. A passed pawn is a pawn that has a path to the end of the board that is unobstructed by any opposing pawns. You need to create passed pawns to win. To create passed pawns, you need to clear a path so your pawns can get past their pawns. There are a few ways to do this. Take your opponent's pawns. If there are any isolated or backwards pawns in the enemy position, use your king and any other remaining pieces to target them. Once you win the pawn, there is a hole in their position. Double their pawns. If you double their pawns, there is a hole in their structure. This is easier to do in the middle game than in the end game. For example, if you trade knights here, the pawn is forced to double, and now there's a nice big juicy hole. Number 3, sacrifice a pawn. Sometimes you can sacrifice a pawn to create a passed pawn, like this, or this. A passed pawn is worth much more than a regular pawn, so it's okay. Connected passed pawns. If you have a single passed pawn, it can often be destroyed with correct defense. If you are able to get 2 or more adjacent pawns through, it is almost impossible to defend. Zugzwang. He said Wang. You aren't allowed to skip moves in chess, so use this to your advantage. In the endgame, you can lock up the position by moving your king and pawns near theirs, and if you time it correctly, they will have no choice but to make a bad move. The word Zugzwang loosely translates to, no draw for you, bitch. Here is an example. White wants to take the pawn on e5, so he moves to d5. Black can put him in Zugzwang like this. The king has to move, which means black wins the pawn. If white comes to d6 instead, black tries the same thing, but now black is in Zugzwang after king d5. This is why it helps to think ahead. Once you have a passed pawn, use your king and any other pieces you have left to get it to the end of the board. You will either successfully get a queen, or they will be forced to trade one of their pieces to get rid of the pawn. If you end up with an extra rook or a queen, watch this video and you will win every time. If you end up with an extra knight or a bishop, use it to take their pawns and then repeat the process of queening a pawn. Simple. And that's everything you need to know about pawns. Once you learn to use the principles in this video, you will gain several thousand rating points and effortlessly beat engines. Just look at this footage of me checkmating Stockfish. Subscribe to the channel to increase your satisfaction with life, like the video to increase the number of likes on the video, and leave a comment asking me what you want to learn next. I'll see you next time.